We are now registering recording. Is everyone accepting
Yes, yeah.
record?
I think everybody else should mute themselves though. So
Okay. Um, right. Ameti tuti. As we have a Russian, we have a wonderful Dante scholar, and it's a splendid group. And I hope I'll be able to do justice to it. Right. Okay. Okay, she's Ameti and Isabella Gonelli. There are many wonderful people present, and I'm so delighted about this. Right. This is the seventh. I think if everyone now mutes themselves, and we'll begin. This is the seventh Academia Bessarion. And this time we're talking about Anchoress and Cardinal, Julian of Norwich and Adam Easton. And we're pretending that we are present during my presentation of this lecture in Norwich Cathedral in 1998. I think it was the 1st of December. When I first visited Norwich, the vergers were telling me of the exhibition held in the cathedral of vast canvases painted by an Australian artist, Alan Oldfield. Let's see if I can need to advance the okay. And they were telling me how strange it was that these huge canvases by an Australian would be painted because of a mere Norwich girl, and not realizing how important Julian of Norwich had become to so many people. And in the painting, we see Julian aged, and in the doorway, Christ enters in Mary's blue, and beyond him, the entire cosmos wheels away. Alan Oldfield died of AIDS, and this painting was hanging in St. Gabriel's of Ditchingham Convent, where I would see it. I'm now going to discuss our anchoress, Julian of Norwich, and a lawyer's daughter, Birgitta of Sweden, a dyer's daughter, Catherine of Siena, a mayor's daughter, Marjorie Kemp of Lynn, and a cardinal, Adam Easton of the Order of St. Benedict, who may have linked them all together in a pan-European textual community of women, literate and illiterate, who wrote visionary books. There are 4 manuscript versions of Julian of Norwich's Showing of Love, further copies of 2 of these, 2 manuscript fragments, 1 report of a conversation held with her, and 4 wills naming her. None of these are written in her own hand, perhaps, but the missing ice skips added to the tops and bottoms of the 1413 Amherst manuscript may be hers. All editions in print today, apart from one which I published after I gave this lecture, fail to faithfully render what we have of Julian's showings. There may, however, be a manuscript that is written by her in her own hand, though it is not Julian of Norwich's Showing of Love. It is in Norwich Castle, and is a collection of texts written by an anchoress for anchoresses. It is beautiful, beginning with a lovely Gothic letter T in gold leaf on a purple ground. Are you able to see these images? Good. Okay. And the work of editing the Julian of manuscripts. In the work of editing the Julian of manuscripts published by Sismel in 2001, I encountered difficulties in dating the versions of the text. In 1990, I asked Westminster Cathedral if I could see their manuscript the following year after an awkward silence, for it had been safely placed in a safe and its whereabouts forgotten, then found again. I was told I could come back and edit it. The manuscript begins with the date 1368. That's this one here, down here. And it was it is the second oldest manuscript we have of Julian's showings. It has no reference to the deathbed vision of 1373. In it, Julian speaks of her desire to die when young, and God tells her this will happen soon. Julian in 1368 was just 25 years old, yet the theology of this manuscript is brilliant. It opens with the great antiphon of the gracious God as wisdom and truth. It shows the nativity of the Word, surrealistically going backwards in time, becoming the Annunciation, the Word within Mary's soul, like the book within Julian's and our hands. The long text refers back to this scene as its first showing, which it is not there. It next includes the hazelnut passage, and it quotes again and again from St. Gregory's dialogues on the life of St. Benedict, on how when the soul sees the Creator, all that is created seems little. Then it turns that inside out, like the beetle's pocket, and speaks of God in a point from Pseudo Dionysius, the Greek church father, and from Boethius, the Latin church father. It discourses upon prayer using Origen and William of Thierry's Golden Epistle. It talks to us of Jesus as mother, partly from John Whiterig's Meditationes, reflecting back to that opening of God and Mary being one in the great antiphon of wisdom, rather than the naughting of this world. Throughout is the theme of wisdom and truth, and the discoursing upon prayer. Julian uses the concept from Pseudo Dionysius, Marguerite Porete, and Dante Alighieri of the Holy Trinity, to which this cathedral is dedicated, having the attributes of might, wisdom, and love. I dedicate this talk to God as Almighty, as all wisdom, and as all love. The long text version of Julian's showing is copied out abroad, first by Zion Brigittine nuns in exile, then by Cambrai Benedictine English nuns in exile because of the Reformation, in 4 manuscripts, and was first printed in 1670. This version is structured as 15 plus 1 showings, lacking as such in Westminster and Amherst, based upon the crucifix and its bleeding that Julian saw when it was held before her, as she and those with her thought she was dying. Julian says within this version of her text that she wrote it 15 to 20 years minus 3 months after that deathbed vision at 30 and a half, on 13th of May or 7th of May 1373, thus writing it when she was 45 or 50, and from 1388 February to 1393. This version includes the Lord and servant parable. What I especially like about the long text is that in the Brigittine Paris manuscript, Christ's words to Julian are given by the scribe in red, like a red letter Bible. We published this with Darton Longman and Todd and St. John's Abbey Liturgical Press, the translation of the manuscripts that way, so that people could experience the effect of the manuscript. The short text is of the circa 1435 1450 Amherst manuscript of the showing, says that its one vision, a vision, was shown to Julian, that is reclus at Norwich, and yet is on leave. She is still alive, and thus 70, its text being written out in 1413. And I love the way you get the same Gothic T and then the H within it and so forth. The Showing of Love manuscript version, Julian scholars currently believe, was written soon after the deathbed vision of 1373, almost 40 years earlier than 1413. But Nicholas Watson was finding that it reflects the greater anxiety typical of that later period, when Chancellor Archbishop Arundel, countering John Wycliffe's Lollard movement, was prohibiting lay people from teaching theology, especially women, and from their using the Bible in the English language. In 1401, the death penalty, de heretico camburendo, the burning of heretics, had been instituted for such teaching, and William Sawtry, Marjorie Kemp's curate of St Margaret's Church, Glynn, had already been so burned in chains at Smithfield. In 1405, Archbishop Richard le Scrope was executed at York by order of King Henry IV, following a scaffold sermon on the five wounds, it taking 3 blows of the sword to kill him, which Brigittines then took up as part of their propaganda for founding Sion Abbey. In 1407-09, Chancellor Archbishop Arundel published his constitutions, requiring the licensing of preachers and ownership of vernacular Bibles, prohibiting the translation of the Bible into English, and limiting writing in the vernacular to such texts as the Creed, the Ten Commandments, the Lord's Prayer, and Standard Doctrine. In 1411 at the Carfax at Oxford, and in 1413 in front of St Paul's, John Wycliffe's books were publicly burned. In 1413 there was further alarm as the Lollards, St John Oldcastle, escaped from the Tower, and the Oldcastle rising was in full swing. Therefore, given such a context, I concur with Nicholas Watson's earlier observations concerning a later date for the short text, and take very seriously indeed the Amherst manuscript's version's own date of 1413, believing that it was written then rather than dictated, or rather dictated to a scribe by a most courageous Julian at 70. For in the short text, Julian seems to comply with Archbishop Arundel's 1407-1409 constitutions, revising the text, excising swathes of scriptural material, adding and engrossing a sentence on the Pater Noster, the Ave, and the Creed, also adding and engrossing St. Cecilia's 3 neck wounds, seeming to conflate those with the Roman martyr who went on preaching for 3 days despite those mortal wounds, with those of the English Archbishop of York, Richard le Scrope's 3 neck wounds in his 1405 execution, saying she's been told of St. Cecilia by a man of Holy Kirk, speaking of the now mandatory worshippings of paintings of crucifixes, albeit with some distaste, and protesting that she had never meant to teach theology. The penalty for teaching or writing theology in English from the Bible at this date was death, either by being burned in chains or by hanging, drawing, and quartering, or both, the crime and the punishment being simultaneously heresy and treason. Such statements would not have been made at an earlier time, either close to 1373 or between 1388-1393, when scriptural study was instead encouraged rather than condemned. Moreover, the coeval Norwich Castle manuscript complies with writing on the Lord's Prayer and giving Carmelite Richard Lavenham's doctrinal treatise on the 7 deadly sins. It was around 1413 that Marjorie Kemp from Lynn visited Julian in her anchor hold at St Julian's, and even courageously visited Archbishop Arundel himself at Lambeth Palace, those two talking theology in the palace's garden under the stars. Sawtry, Marjorie's curate, had been the first person executed in England during these purges. Marjorie herself was often imprisoned, put on trial by bishops, and frequently threatened with death. The words of the two texts, Julian's Amherst showing of love and the book of Marjorie Kemp, resonate with each other, almost as if we're listening to Julian in stereo. Both texts speak of God in the city of our soul, the body as its temple. Both thus argue from Paul in the Bible at the risk of their lives that their women's bodies do not exclude them from Christ's church. Such texts quote material concerning the discernment of spirits from Birgitta of Sweden's Revelationes in his Epistola Solitaria, written not by Birgitta of Sweden herself, but by her editor, Bishop Hermit Alfonso of Jaen, and echoed in turn in the Defensorium Sanctae Birgittae, written by a Norwich Benedictine, Adam Easton. Of interest also is that the Amherst manuscript, the earliest extant of Julian's showing of love, survived because it was safely within the cloisters of Brigittine Sion Abbey and Carthusian Sheen Priory, following that in the hands of recusant families in England. The early exemplars in Norwich were destroyed, likely either by Arundel's constitutions for being Lollard or by the Reformation for being Catholic, though Ian Doyle did not rule out the possibility that this section of this manuscript was written, as it says, 1413. Now, all of the Julian scholars are against this, so I'm in trouble. Um, clustered with Julian's text in the Amherst manuscript are others of great interest. One of them, Marguerite Porete's Mirror of Simple Souls, who she was condemned on the basis of 15 articles by 21 doctors of theology of the university for the writing of that book. Her inquisitors, including Victorines, Carmelites, Austin canons, Cistercians, and Benedictines, the Franciscan Nicholas of Lyra among them. Scholars on the continent now claim that Marguerite Porete's Mirror of Simple Souls, influenced by Guillaume de Thierry's Golden Epistle and Pseudo Dionysius's writings, next influenced Meister Eckhart and the Friends of God movement. Another work called the Golden Epistle, Marguerite Porete's Mirror of Simple Souls, Jan van Ruysbroek's Sparkling Stone, and an extract from Henry Sousa's Horologium Sapientiae in Middle English are all included with the earliest surviving Julian of showing text in the Amherst manuscript. With this hypothesis of a woman able to write outstanding theology at 25 in 1368 in the Westminster manuscript, at 45-50 in 1388-1393 in the Paris manuscript, and at 70 in 1413 in the Amherst manuscript. I next sought not the evidence within her surviving manuscripts, where I first encountered it, but that of her own life's context. And that was when I discovered a similarly brilliant Norwich Benedictine. Let me introduce you to a young novice named now Adam Easton, but who wrote his name as Weston. Okay, let's see if I can. Okay, right now we need to go back and right, and he perhaps from the village a few miles west of Norwich, or which could have been Westwick in Norwich's Jewry, where inhabitants once paid for the building of this cathedral, who would have paced the floors of this cathedral and of its cloister, and read the manuscripts in its library and written manuscripts in its scriptorium. Among his schoolboy manuscripts are studies of Arabic mathematics and astronomy. One of these, now at Cambridge University Library, has his drawings of how to measure the height of the spire of this cathedral and of the walls of Norwich Castle, in which these structures are clearly recognizable, while also giving Grosseteste's tractate on squaring the circle, which is also at the end of Dante's Commedia. Adam Easton, together with Thomas Brinton, was sent to study at Oxford in 1350, where he was soon teaching the Hebrew of the Old Testament. He also discovered during this period the writings of Pseudo Dionysius, who was thought in the Greek and Latin churches to be the Dionysius converted by Paul on the Areopagus in Athens, together with the woman Damaris in Acts 17. Actually, Pseudo Dionysius is a Syrian theologian who lived several centuries later and who pretended to be the converted Athenian Dionysius. That's why we call him Pseudo Dionysius. He wrote marvelous but flawed theology. He invented, for instance, the most unchristian word and concept, hierarchy. Unlike Christ's Gospels, he believed intensely in hierarchies in the church and among angels. For this reason, emperors and kings, both East and West, sought his collected works and propagated them in manuscripts, one of which Adam Easton himself, this one, he owned. It's a beautiful manuscript in Latin and Greek, and the prayer to the Trinity as wisdom is illuminated with the most lovely Romanesque tea and lapis lazuli blue and with green intertwines. Recall that the kings of France are buried in the Benedictine Abbey of Saint Denis outside Paris. The French believing that this Saint Dionysius, their patron, Saint Denis, had written the theology Adam and Julian used, and even that he was also the martyred apostle to the French, who was beheaded at Montmartre, then picked up his head and carried it about, as well as having been Paul's convert in Athens. The Gothic style and its later, let's see if I can, yeah, um, and its later ramifications, which this cathedral and East Anglian churches came to use, and which I showed in the lecture with a slide of Walsingham's Slipper Chapel, but which I can illustrate here with the cathedral itself, in which this lecture was given, began at the Benedictine Abbey of Saint Denis in response to Pseudo Dionysius' Neoplatonist delight in hierarchy, mirroring it in stone tracery and glass. Similarly, the Victorine monks pored over Pseudo Dionysius, weaving from the text an elaborate theology. Easton himself being thoroughly immersed in the writings of Hugh and Andrew of St. Victor on the priesthood. Abelard alone, himself a monk of Saint Denis, observed the fraudulence of all this legendary material, for which he was not popular. The King of France's authority and the hierarchy of the French church and state greatly depended upon it. Interestingly, Julian does not like hierarchies, but speaks instead of her even Christians, our even Christians. Nor does she appreciate the way clerks revere the ranks of angels, and she says so in The Showing of Love, in what is perhaps a dig at Pseudo Dionysius, Adam Easton, and Walter Hilton, all of whom were writing on angelic hierarchies. Julian speaking instead of our oneing as Adam directly with God, who created us in that image which is his own. Adam Easton was very happy at Oxford. Arabic, mathematics, Hebrew philology, and Greek theology suited him fine. He was fascinated with time and eternity, with how to measure smaller and smaller amounts of time. He was also intrigued by time's immensity and writes out dates in Arabic numerals, including those we would expect: 1368, 1373, but going on to not just our year 2000, when I gave this lecture, just about, but the years 40,000, 90,000, 100,000. He hated wasting time. Julian shares that concern. Adam Easton was as well deeply versed in spirituality. A Benedictine student who overlapped with Adam Easton at Oxford was John Whiteridge, who later became a hermit on Farne Island, writing on St. Cuthbert, and in the Meditations on Jesus as Mother, which Julian will quote in her showing. Amongst Easton's lost Dionysian Victorine writings, perhaps destroyed at the Reformation, are a work on the perfection of the spiritual life and translations into the vernacular. He lived an active life as teacher and diplomat, but yearned too, like John Whiteridge, to be a solitary, a hermit, an anchorite. I believe he was to make Julian be his contemplative surrogate while he paced corridors of power. And I also think he's the cloud of unknowing writer because all of his texts and interests overlap with those of the cloud of unknowing, which at the same time people haven't noticed is written to a woman and perhaps to Julian. However, the Bishop of Norwich wanted him back from Oxford, along with a fellow Benedictine, Joe, likely the brilliant John Stukeley, in 1352. Adam wrote to the Pope begging to be allowed to continue working towards his degree, appealing against his bishop. Next, the prior of this cathedral demanded that Thomas Brinton and he return, and that they bring back with them all their books and silver plate. Benedictines must obey their abbot or prior as if he were Christ. So Adam and Thomas now dutifully came back to Norwich and were here from 1356 to 1363. The prior needed Adam Easton and Thomas Brinton to preach to the Norwich laity, to woo them back from the Franciscans and the Dominicans, from the Carmelites and the Augustinians, who were becoming far too powerful and casting this vast Benedictine cathedral into the shadows. We learn that the sermons of the two young men were lively and well attended by the laity. Adam's sermons would have included such material as Pseudo Dionysius on God in a point, on God as I am, which becomes Julian's I it am, and on God as Mother, on the Bible text translated directly from Hebrew into Middle English, and on the Trinity as might, wisdom, and love. All of this material is in Julian's 1368 Westminster manuscript. During this period, Easton copied out polemical works against the Franciscans, even illuminating in one of them grey-clad Franciscans, black and white-clad Dominicans, white-clad Carmelites, and grey-clad Augustinians with devils at their throats. Finally, he was able to return to Oxford, being prior of students there, 20th of September 1366. We have a huge bill paid for the shipping by wagon of the manuscripts, 113 shillings and threepence. Julian's largest legacy from Isabel, Countess of Suffolk, was a mere 20 shillings. Among these manuscripts would have been Pseudo Dionysius' works, Origin on Leviticus, perhaps one by Rabbi David Kimhi on Hebrew philology in Hebrew. Next, and now addressed as master, Adam Easton left Norwich to work for Cardinal Langham at Avignon, where the Pope was then residing. It was at Avignon that Master Adam Easton came to own John of Salisbury's Polycraticus, now at Balliol, by writing it out himself. Julian will use its political language again and again in her 1388-1393 long text. Adam Easton was professionally jealous of his Oxford colleague, John Wycliffe, and wrote to the Benedictines in Westminster Abbey, asking that they send him reports on Wycliffe's Oxford lectures against the Benedictines. Wycliffe and Julian were for gospel equality, Eastern for Dionysian hierarchy, while at the papal curia in Avignon and later in Rome, where the learned and ambitious Adam Easton himself became cardinal, he came to know Birgitta of Sweden and Catherine of Siena, and learned to admire them for their visionary writings, perhaps because he already knew of a Norwich lass writing a similar book, and perhaps because he already knew of Birgitta's revelations. At this point, we need to journey across the Northern Sea to Scandinavia, to Finland and Sweden. This diptych shows Bishop Hemming of Åbo, Finland, and Birgitta of Sweden, whom he encouraged to write her revelations, her visions. Birgitta was a Swedish noblewoman, mother of 8 children, widowed young, who had an important vision in Arras in France, often when returning from pilgrimage to Compostela in 1342, the year Julian was born, and in which St. Dionysius had spoken to Birgitta of the need for peace between Kings Philip VI of France and Edward III of England. Birgitta even sent envoys from Sweden to the kings of England and France and to the Pope in 1347, 1348, pleading for peace in Europe and the end to the Hundred Years' War. These envoys, including Prior Petrus and this Bishop Hemming, who conveyed the text of her visions, the revelationes, or showings, introduced by Magister Matthias, a Swedish scholar who had studied Hebrew in Paris. Magister Matthias was brilliant, filled with doubts, and Birgitta proceeded to teach him his theology, writing this out in her vision of the ladder in Book 5 in the Book of Questions of the Revelations, which came to her while journeying to the king's palace at Vadstena on horseback to be given to her for her convent. Julian and her editor will quote this text in her long text and short text showing of love. Thus, England had already known of a woman's text called the Revelationes, the showings, but 20 years before Julian's hypothetical writing of the initial version of her revelations or showings. Birgitta's revelations are modelled upon John's revelations, the book of the Apocalypse, but written by a woman instead of a man, including the theme of theological doubting by men countered by women's faith. It is also likely that these Baltic envoys disembarked at one of the Norfolk ports, like Lynn, the Swedish brothers and sisters from Vadstena's Abbey, so came to help Henry IV. Henry V found the English Brigittine Zion Abbey, where Julian's manuscripts were to be so carefully preserved. Catullus Thorbany, coming from Vadstena on preparatory mission in England in 1408. Perhaps the embassy visited Norwich, then the second largest city in England, on their way to King Edward III. The young Benedictine, Adam Easton, had not at that date left Norwich Cathedral Priory for Oxford University. Prior Petrus and Bishop Hemming could have been here, within these very cathedral walls, with that early vision of Birgitta's revelations or showings in their hand. During the Black Death, okay, Birgitta herself left Sweden and came to Italy in 1350. In this political allegory painted on the walls of the Spanish chapel in Santa Maria Novella in Florence, we can see Birgitta and of Sweden, her daughter Catherine of Sweden, um, Queen Joanna of Naples, and Lapa Acciaioli, sister of Niccolo Acciaioli, who out of his guilt for his sins had built the vast monastery of Certosa outside of Florence, and who had died in Birgitta's presence in November 1366. Birgitta continued writing her revelations, her showings throughout her whole life, now with the assistance and oversight of a Spanish bishop become hermit, Alfonso of Jaen, who first was drawn into her circle in 1368, the year that Birgitta of Sweden succeeded in bringing both Pope Urban V from Avignon and the Emperor Charles from Prague to Rome. And that's what this scene is celebrating, the Pope and the Emperor meeting together, but in Florence instead of Rome. Another illustration of Birgitta um, in the act of writing comes from a manuscript written from, this is from the printed text, and this is where she's presenting the revelations to the bishop hermit. And this is actually written, this manuscript is written by Catherine of Siena's secretary Cristofano Digano, um, who which gives the entire revelations of St. Birgitta translated into Sienese Italian and today still in Siena, while Christopher Digano's translation into Latin of Catherine's Dialogo in Sienese Italian will come to England and eventually be printed as the Orchard of Sion. Another disciple to Catherine of Siena, and indeed her executor, was the Englishman William Fleet, who became an Augustinian hermit at Lecceto outside Siena, who had, like Walter Hilton, been educated at Cambridge. Julian quotes from Fleet again and again in all of her versions of the showing of love. Master Adam Easton returned again to England and Norwich that same year with a letter from Pope Urban V to Edward III, dated 3rd of May, which was yesterday, 1368. He was back in Avignon in 1369. Julian's Westminster Cathedral showing version of her text was perhaps written in 1368. I've told of his lovely opening, invoking, "Oh, um, uh, our gracious good Lord God," and its vision of the Virgin at the Nativity and Annunciation, spoken of in the long text as the first showing. And then we move into her most moving vision. And Hebrew has the letter that begins God's name, and Jerusalem's and Judea's and Joshua's and Jesus's and Julian's be the smallest letter of all, Yod, and be the letter which means hand. And here we see, have the vision of Julian holding the hazelnut in the palm of her hand. And I use Michelangelo's own hand as a sculptor for his David. And we have the medieval iconography of the image of God holding in his hand all that is, the entire universe of which he is king, the whole cosmos as a ball, even as a fragile glass ball surmounted by a cross. Similarly, Richard II and Elizabeth II and countless other kings and queens have held orbs, the globe with the cross of Jerusalem at its top, in their imaging of God at their coronations. But here it is not God or Edward III who holds all this fragile globe, this blue marble astronauts see from space. It is Julian, the anchoress, and she holds in her hand a small thing, the quantity of a hazelnut, and she is told generally in her understanding by God that it is all that is made. And this is from the Westminster manuscript, which I discovered and love. Julian, like wisdom in Proverbs 8, like Gregory on Benedict, is playing with God marvelous, sacred, cosmic games of proportion. And she and God invite us to join in. Easton wrote that Adam was the first high priest. We are the royal priesthood, priests and kings, each of us, being descended from Adam in Julian's thought. In the following year, 1370, Birgitta of Sweden presented Pope Urban V and Cardinal Beaufort, who was to become the next Pope, Gregory XI, another edition of her massive book, the Revelations or Showings. And in that year, The Dominican Thomas Stubbs and the Carmelite Richard Lavenham were lecturing on Begitta's revelations or showings at Oxford. In that year, too, the Pope appointed Henry le Despencer, Bishop of Norwich, who had fought beside Sir John Hawkwood in Italy. So we now begin to see that Julian's homely Norwich is really pan-European, with important links to Scandinavia and to Italy. The Italians call Sir John Hawkwood Gianni Acuto, whom we see here in the fresco by Paolo Uccello in Florence's Cathedral and the Duomo. In Siena's Sala della Pace, we can see Ambrogio Lorenzetti's depiction of Siena at peace and of Siena at war during warfare waged by these English condottieri. Terry Jones in Chaucer's Night describes them well. St. Catherine of Siena was so appalled at their brutality that she wrote to Sir John Hawkwood, begging that he take such soldiers as Henry le Despencer away from Christian Tuscany and have them wage instead a crusade against the Saracen. This enthronement as bishop of a condottieri came about because the Pope received word of the previous Bishop of Norwich's death while Henry le Despencer was standing before him and whom he had to pay. He did so with the bishopric and constantly called upon Bishop le Despencer to wage crusades against fellow Christians who had elected an opposing pope to himself. It is not likely that Bishop le Despencer, who was unlettered and martial, would have initially allowed Julian to become an anchoress in the anchorhold at St. Julian's Church in Norwich. St. Julian's Anchorhold and Church were under the patronage of the Benedictine nuns of Carrow Priory, and which in turn was under the patronage of the Benedictine monks of Norwich Cathedral Priory. The Benedictines of Norwich Cathedral Priory and Bishop le Despencer thoroughly hated each other and were only reconciled years later. It is at this point we find the first reference to Julian as being left money in wills to carry out her work of prayer at St. Julian's. She may have earned her keep earlier, as had been typical for anchoresses, in teaching children their ABC and their catechism. Under Archbishop Chancellor Arundel's constitution, such teaching came to be forbidden by the laity. In 1371-1373, Cardinal Simon Langham and Master Adam Easton were asked by Pope Gregory XI to work on peace between England and France, in accordance with Birgitta of Sweden's 1342 revelation, which is copied out in English manuscripts, giving St. Dionysius speaking to Birgitta in Arras of the need for peace between the kings of France and England. We have further evidence of Easton's presence in England at this time. Easton would again have returned to his mother house, Norwich Cathedral Priory, around 1371-1373. He would have been even the religious person at Julian's supposed deathbed in May of 1373, for that is the term typically used of a Benedictine monk living under the vows of religion. Julian tells us that when she told this person of her vision of the crucifix bleeding fast, he suddenly stopped laughing and took her very seriously indeed, of which she was greatly ashamed. Adam Easton at this time would have taken very seriously indeed a woman's vision, especially of the crucifix, but that was the most famous and recent vision that his friend Birgitta of Sweden had had, of the crucifix which spoke to her at St. Paul's outside the walls in Rome in 1368. And he would not have been the appropriate person, however, to whom she could then make her confession concerning the discernment of spirits. And she's greatly concerned about making that confession. We also have Marjorie Kemp going bonkers because she's terrified of making a particular confession. Yet Julian's vision in Norwich is quite different from that of Birgitta's 1368 vision in Rome. As she gazed upon the crucifix, let's see, right. Uh, as she gazed upon the crucifix, Julian began to see the blood flow from the garland of thorns about Christ's head. She describes it as like rain upon thatched eaves, and we know that Julian's church roof was thatched at that time. And she describes it also as like the scales of herring fish that would have been brought up the river so near to her church, and along whose shores merchants built vast storage barns. Along that street also parchment was made for use by monks and friars and such like who would have been literate in Julian's day in Norwich. The parchment for Julian's own book, as showing, would have been bought by her maid in that street. For Julian's maids Sarah and Alice are named in wills made in her favour. She herself was enclosed and could do no shopping. One of the maids, in turn, perhaps, became an anchoress, Alice Hermit, leaving a silver chalice to a Norwich church in her will. Julian simply refuses to make her crucifix vision political in the way that Birgitta of Sweden does. Instead, she has it be homely and familiar, likening it to rain and herring. And she also evades it, distancing herself from it, speaking in the Amherst manuscript even like a Lollard, like the executed William Sawtry, Marjorie Kemp's St. Margaret's chaplain, with distaste of the now legally mandated prayers to paintings of crucifixes. Julian also describes what she saw in relation to the Veronica veil shown to pilgrims in Rome's Vatican Basilica on Good Friday. Sister Rita Mary Bradley suggested from her words that Julian had actually travelled to Rome and seen this precious relic. If she had so travelled to Rome, she would have likely stayed under the aegis of Cardinal Adam Easton and his household, composed of many people from Norwich, as we see from his Roman will, and which was headquartered in his titular church of St. Cecilia in Trastevere. Much of that church has been altered, but to this day one can see in its crypt the ruins of a Roman house and bath with hot springs, the Sudatorium, which features in the legend of Cecilia's martyrdom, the fine Byzantine apse showing the togaed Christ with scroll and as teacher, flanked by Paul and Peter, by Cecilia and Valerian, and by Pope Paschal, carrying the model of this church, and St. Agatha, whom Paschal made co-patroness of this church, as well as medieval buildings more in English than in Italian style, clustering about the now baroque basilica. In Julian's day, an entire series of frescoes existed giving the life and miracles of Cecilia. The marriage feast of Valerian and Cecilia, Cecilia having Valerian seek Pope Urban I, Valerian riding to Urban, Valerian's baptism, the angel crowning Valerian and Cecilia, Cecilia converting her executioner, Cecilia in the bath, the execution of Cecilia, her burial, then Paschal's dream, of which only the last fresco survives, copies of those which were destroyed being kept in the Barberini library. Pope Paschal I described how he had a vision in St. Peter's of St. Cecilia, where she appeared to him in golden robes, telling him of her burial place beside her husband and brother-in-law in St. Calixtus catacombs. He found them and brought them to her church, and the following day reburying her there as she was. A 16th century cardinal then exhumed her, finding her incorrupt, lying on her side, robed in gold tissue, and commissioned Maderno, likewise an eyewitness, to sculpt her so. The mosaic similarly garbed Christ, Cecilia, Paschal, and Agatha in cloth of gold. If Julian had been a pilgrim guest at St. Cecilia in Trastevere, walking beside the Tiber to Vatican St. Peter's one Good Friday, these Roman memories would have heightened her use of the Veronica veil, St. Cecilia's martyrdom of the three neck wounds, and of her 3 days' preaching. And here we see, okay, this is the manuscript mentioning in large letters St. Cecilia. And Julian's own ever present theme of Christ as teacher, of Christ as master, the Galilean Palestinian Master Jesus, shadowed by that of her Norwich, Oxford, Avignon, Rome Master Adam, become Cardinal of St. Cecilia in Trastevere and supporter of Birgitta of Sweden. Birgitta of Sweden died the same year, and in the month following Julian's illness, 23rd of June 1373, the vigil of St. Mary Magdalene, following her return from Jerusalem in Rome, her body first being laid upon this tawny board, on which she customarily ate and wrote her revelations, and it then was laid at her death. Her body was then brought to Sweden and laid to rest in this magnificent shrine at Vadstena, where her monastery was founded. Catherine of Siena was examined by the Dominicans in that year in the Spanish chapel, Santa Maria Novella, Florence, amidst its frescoes of her friend Catherine of Sweden and of Birgitta of Sweden. Birgitta's director and her appointed executor, the hermit bishop Alfonso of Jaen, gave Birgitta's revelations to Pope Gregory XI and was next appointed by the Pope to serve as Catherine of Siena's director, at which point the illiterate Catherine miraculously began writing, or rather dictating, sometimes to three secretaries at once, letters to popes and emperors, and even to our Richard II and to the Englishman Sir John Hawkwood, the Marshal Bishop of Norwich's former companion as condottiere in Italy. Catherine of Siena, like Birgitta, next composed a theological visionary work, the Rivelazione or Dialogo, a copy of which was brought here to England, likely by Adam Easton, who knew her, and perhaps translated into Middle English by him, who is noted to have made such translations. De communicatione idiomatum, de diversitate translationem, de perfectione vitae spiritualis. And this was later printed as the Orchard of Zion by Winken de Worde at Zion Abbey. And I love this early printed book with its rubrication and so on. And its wording is so similar to what we find also in Julian's text. And in 1379, Alfonso of Jaen, 3rd of March, Adam Easton, 9th of March, and Catherine of Siena, Birgitta's daughter, 10th of March, all testified on behalf of the validity of Pope Urban VI's election. Adam Easton presented to Pope Urban VI his magnum opus, the Defensorum Ecclesiasticae Potestatis, the defense of ecclesiastical power, based on Dionysian hierarchies, and for which he read and countered Dante Alighieri. It ends with the Augustinian, Thou hast created us for thyself, O Lord, and our hearts can find no rest until they rest in thee, a passage Julian uses in the Westminster and subsequent showings. In that same year, Alfonso of Jaen wrote the Epistola Solitari in defense of Birgitta's visions, and he edited her entire revelations in preparation for her canonization. The material of Alfonso of Jaen's Epistola Solitari on the discernment of spirits is found in William Fleet's pre 1379 Remedies Against Temptations, in the Cloud author's treatment and discernment of spirits, in the treatise on Catherine of Siena found in East Anglian Cloud manuscripts, in Adam Easton's 1390 Defensorum Sanctae Birgittae, and in the chastising of God's children. The Epistola Salutare also exists, translated into Middle English, in a Norfolk manuscript of Birgitta's Revelationes. Catherine of Siena, the Dominican tertiary, died in 1380, equally revered by Romans as had been Birgitta of Sweden. At her death, she was surrounded by her disciples, women and men, and with her mother at her side, a scene strongly echoing that of the 1373 of Julian's deathbed in Norwich. In 1391, Adam Easton was made a cardinal and was given the Basilica of St. Cecilia in Trastevere in Rome. As cardinal, Adam Easton worked to effect the marriage coronation between his King of England, Richard II, with Anne of Bohemia, daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles of Bohemia. This manuscript, the 1382 Liber Regalis, illuminated by a Bohemian artist, which is still used for the coronation of our queens and kings, shows Richard and his consort Anne in Benedictine Westminster Abbey. The theology of the Liber Regalis is Adam Easton's, speaking of how the Benedictine abbot of Westminster must instruct the king in humility, and basing it upon Hebrew narratives of prophets and anointed kings, speaking of Aaron, Nathan, and Zadok, the epistle to the Hebrews, Jerome, Pseudo Dionysius, and the Victorines. The exquisite Wilton diptych, again by Bohemian artist, shows Richard II in prayer, kneeling on the ground in the wilderness before his patrons, John the Baptist, Edward the Confessor, and St. Edwin the Martyr, while yet another um, shows Geoffrey Chaucer reading Troilus and Cressida to Richard II. In that same year, Adam Easton was appointed as one of the three cardinals to have oversight of Brigitta's cause for canonization, and it was noted that either then or more likely later, he was prepared to risk his theological reputation and over this matter in order to further a cause in which he believed, and moreover one in which he was personally involved. In 1377, the townsfolk of Lynn had rebelled against, routed, and wounded the Lord Bishop Henry le Despencer of Norwich because he, excuse me, he insisted on their mayor's mace being borne before him as he entered the city gates. The particular mayor in question was one John Brunham, father of our Margery Kemp. In 1391, the Bishop of Norwich, true to form, acted swiftly to quell the peasants' revolt. The Bishop, Thomas Walsingham, tells us, dressed as a knight, wearing an iron helm and a solid hauberk, impregnable to armour, as he wielded a real two-edged sword, though clergy were forbidden to use more than a mace when fighting. Walsingham goes on to compare the warlike priest to a wild boar, gnashing his teeth, neither sparing himself nor his enemies. In particular, he oversaw the execution of the peasants' Norwich leader, the dyer John Litester, the acclaimed king of the commons, and the idol of the people, hearing his confession and holding up his head during the drawing before Litester's execution by being next hanged and quartered. Let me show some paintings of crucifixes. This is an illumination in a manuscript owned by Westminster's Benedictine abbot Nicholas Littlingham between 1382 1386. And then this is the Bishop of Norwich commissioned this commemorative retabler. Sheila Upjohn notes following Litter's execution. It is now restored in Norwich Cathedral, for which it was originally intended, after having spent some centuries as a table bottom following the Reformation. Apparently, someone discovered it in 1847 because he dropped a pencil during a meeting, crawled under the table to retrieve it, and looked up to see this gold leaf splendor. Here I continue Sheila Upjohn's perception. Julian describes the head of Christ having the skin torn, as if it had been dragged along the road. the medieval form of execution being preceded by the drawing of the victim along the street, as was done to Leicester. Julian describes the drying of Jesus' body as it hangs upon the cross for more than that of a body strung up for many days upon the gallows, drying in the Norfolk wind and the cold, than Jesus' crucifixion of but 6 hours in Jerusalem. When I look at Bishop Despenser's Reitable, I seem to see Despenser portrayed in the image of Pilate, Leicester, the King of the Commons, in the image of Christ. The following year, the Norfolk people attempted to revolt again and to kill their bishop, but the revolt was again swiftly put down. The Blackfriars Council, the Earthquake Council, instigated by Adam Easton and mentioned by Julian in the showings, condemned Wycliffe's writings because Wycliffe had condemned Benedictine wealth. John Wycliffe dying at Lutterworth the following year. Wycliffe was for equality, Easton for hierarchy. Wycliffe for translating the Bible from Latin into English, Easton for translating the Bible from Hebrew into Latin. The Norwich Carmelite John Bale noting of him, Iste multa opuscula edidisse per se tempora perhibite, ac Biblia tota ab Hebreo in Latinum transtulisse. Julian seems to mediate between them. Then for Adam Easton, on 11th of January 1385, disaster struck. Pope Urban VI, in his paranoia against his corrupt cardinals, even punished those who were loyal to him for their just criticism of his errors. The cardinals were hurled into a dungeon at Norwich and cruelly tortured. One of them was our Norwich Benedictine, Cardinal Adam Easton of England. Immediately, King Richard II, the English Benedictine Congregation, Oxford University, and the English Parliament wrote letters in defence of Cardinal Adam Easton, begging that the Pope bind up his wounds with wine and oil, referring to the Good Samaritan parable, and restore him to liberty. And the cardinalate. Pope Urban VI had to flee 20th of August to Genoa by ship, and on his arrival, 23rd of September, the other 5 cardinal prisoners had disappeared, executed at sea. Easton, despite these passionate pleas, and despite his own continuing loyalty to the Pope, remained a prisoner until the following Pope's accession in 1389, nearly 5 years. At least his life was saved. While in that dungeon, awaiting death and so terribly tortured and injured, Easton had prayed that if he were to be spared, he would work for the canonization of St. Birgitta of Sweden, who had died 12 years earlier, in the year of and the month after Julian's showing, and for whose cause for canonization he had been given responsibility with 2 other cardinals in 1382. When he was released, he immediately made his way back to Norwich with the necessary documentation, including the massive illuminated revelationes or showings she had written. We have the bills for the shipping of his books to Norwich through Flanders, Norwich Cathedral Priory Master paying 48 shillings 7 pence, the almoner 10 shillings pro carriagio librorum domini cardinalis, the Benedictine Prior of Lynn contributing 20 shillings, circa libros domini ade de eston. Remember that Julian's very largest bequest was a mere 20 shillings. This is the evidence that in 1389-1390, Cardinal Adam Easton returned home here to Norwich Cathedral Priory, and in this cloister he set to work writing the Defensorum Sanctae Birgittae, the defense of St. Birgitta, the document for her canonization, sent next to Pope Boniface IX, to the Brigittine abbess in Vadstena, Sweden, and to Bishop Hermit Alfonso of Jaen, and which he didn't realize had already died in Genoa, 19th of August, 1389. I learned of those bills because I was sitting across the table from Joan Gretrix in Cambridge University Library. I was admiring Easton's beautiful Dionysian manuscript with its lovely green, leafy, and gold leaf Gothic tea for the invocation to the Trinity, and she was working on Benedictine archival records throughout England. The devil's advocate for the cause for the canonization, a Perugian theologian, using Nicholas of Lyra's 1310 15 articles against Brigitte Marguerite Porete, had argued in 41 articles that women are unworthy to have visions of God. Um, Marjorie Kemp similarly had such articles placed against her by theologians. Cardinal Adam Easton countered this claim using Nicholas of Lyra dialectically in his Defensorum Sanctae Begitae, speaking of the Old Testament women prophetesses, of the holy women at the tomb, who had the vision of the resurrection, and who were the apostles to the apostles of that good news, the gospel, which the disciples considered but idle tales, and of Philip's 4 virgin daughters in Acts 21, who were all prophetesses. He continued by speaking of the virgin saints like Agnes, to whom St. Peter appeared, and and Agatha and Cecilia, co-patrons of his cardinal basilica in Trastevere, all of whom are named in the canon of the Mass. He next speaks of Peter's Quo Vadis vision of Christ at Rome and Thomas's vision of Christ in Jerusalem. He speaks of women's far greater faith than men, the men denying and doubting Christ, the women staying at the cross. He states that women's visionary books are valid in the eyes of the Church. Consequently, Birgitta of Sweden was canonized as saint in Rome, 7th of October 1391. Marguerite Porete's Mirror of Simple Souls is included with Julian showing in the Amherst manuscript. Adam Easton's Defensorium, echoed in the Amherst showing conclusion, was as a concluding imprimatur to manuscripts of the Revelationes, but was replaced in the Editio Princeps by Tura Cremata's defense, penned following the 1433 Council of Basel. Nevertheless, the prior of Norwich, present at that council, continued Norwich's interest in the saint. Our Norwich Benedictine Cardinal. Okay, I meant to show this. I love this. Is the mosaic of St. Agnes, who taught Birgitta Latin because she found she couldn't learn from men who scoffed at women, but she could from a native speaker who was just 12 years old and who presented to her a jewel from her crown for every insult men gave her. And this is in the Revelations, and I love the story. Our Norwich Benedictine Cardinal Adam Easton was here in 1389, 1391. Indeed, it is likely he who, as a man of Holy Kirk, um, told not only the Pope of Rome, the Abbess of Vadstena, the Bishop Hermit Alfonso of Jaen, whom he thought was at Genoa, but also Julian here in Norwich, the story of St. Cecilia, the patron of his church in Rome as Cardinal, Santa Cecilia in Trastevere. In 1390, Westminster Abbey received a copy of the bull of Boniface IX, restoring Cardinal Adam Easton to his English benefices taken from him unjustly. We only learn of the cardinal's return to Rome as late as 1396, apart from the dubious account in the later Diarium Vadstenensis, which describes him as present at the canonization of St. Birgitta, 7th of October 1391. 1388, February 1393, is exactly the time span the anchoress Julian of Norwich tells us within her text that she was formulating and writing her second version of the Revelations of Divine Love, her long text showing her magnum opus in the same title as Birgitta's massive book. In it, we can see she is building upon an earlier version of the text, expanding it, cross referencing it back and forth, often speaking of a first showing, but which is not the Christological first showing of the 15 plus 1, for that is the crown of thorns, but instead is of the opening and Marian first showing of the Westminster manuscript. She interestingly adds a magnificent section that is not in the table of context of the 15 plus 1 showings, the parable of the Lord and the servant. She tells us at the showing's ending that it's not yet ended, that she's not yet satisfied with it, that she will write yet another version of it. That reminds one of the way Dante Alighieri writes his texts, their ending being their beginnings again. It is also how Simbagita had constructed her magnum opus across almost half a century, in edition upon edition, book upon book. Perhaps by this date, perhaps not. Julian was an anchoress at St. Julian's Church, within walking distance of this cathedral, where the convalescing cardinal is studying the book of the same title, and likewise written by a woman, and edited by his friend and associate Alfonso of Jaen, in fulfillment of the vow he had made during his dungeon torture in 1385. And I think I'm going to have to skip over a bit because it's rather lengthy. And in the parable, which is wonderful, I read it allegorically on many levels, in the way that Dante Alighieri writes in the Commedia. It is both scriptural exegesis about God as man, God creating Adam in his own image in Genesis, then God the Father sending God the Son in that same image in the Gospels as Jesus, which means in Hebrew, God saves, to save Adam, which in our Hebrew means every man, every woman. Jesus himself in the Gospels calling himself Son of Man, Ben Adam, Bar Adam, our brother, we his mother, his brothers, his sisters. But it also reads like a political allegory of the Pope and of his loyal cardinal who had fallen into a dungeon, a deep slade, where he lies sorely wounded from torture and who seeks to return to his Lord. Julian tells us, okay, this um, that this servant is Adam, and she uses the same words about the meaning of Adam as does Adam Easton in his own writings. Both know the Hebrew meanings for Adam being every man, earth, tawny, red. I show here Simone Martini's diptych that beautifully illustrates Julian's not showing of love. Its Marian first showing, its Christological 15 plus 1 showings. It shows Christ in the Pietà with tawny red hair, as son of Adam, son of David. For David also in Hebrew is ruddy, tawny, with beautiful eyes. And then gradually in the allegory, she represents fallen Adam, shadowed in the imprisoned cardinal, then turns into the risen Christ, the Son and heir of the kingdom of heaven, who comes to sit at the Lord's right hand of Psalm 110 and the Epistle to the Hebrews, but not in the literal sense, instead as being honored, as indeed Adam Easton was, the Pope writing to Parliament commending him. Both Adam and Julian, in their theology derived from Rabbi David Kimhi, speak of Adam as all of us, in the general man, all of us before fellow heirs with Christ in the kingdom of heaven. The biographies of Cardinal Adam Easton note that he translated the entire Hebrew Bible, though it was stolen from him except for the Psalter and is now lost. He had lectured on the Hebrew scriptures at Oxford, and he owned the writings of Rabbi David Kimhi. Kimhi countered Kabbalistic learning and Maimonides' skepticism, pleading for the return to philology in studying theology. He argued, Jerome, your translator, has corrupted the text by saying, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand, and I will make your enemies my footstool, in Psalm 101. Literally, that meant instead to be treated honorably, which is precisely what Julian says in her text. Kimhi also says this in reference to is just to an ordinary Lord, not the Messiah, which both Easton and Julian ignore, for their reading is in our creed. There is yet another layer to this allegory. Julian tells us the Lord is garbed in blue, seated on the ground in a wilderness. And let's see if I can find. Okay, we're not quite there yet. And that is the Virgin's colour in the 1368 Westminster Manuscript version. Julian had Jesus become our mother, become his mother, Adam Easton at Avignon, would have been familiar with the fresco painted by Simone Martini of the Virgin in humility, where she's seated in blue on the ground with the donor of that painting, the Cardinal Stefaneschi in his scarlet, kneeling in prayer before her. We recall Richard II, the Lord and King of England, in cloth of gold, kneeling on the ground in a wilderness in the Wilton diptych. But there is more. Cardinal Jerome had written to the Roman noblewoman Fabiola a treatise explaining the high priest Aaron's garb in Exodus, specifically dwelling upon the hyacinthine blue of his ephod. Adam Easton won his cardinalate through writing of that material on the Pope as Christendom's high priest, as Aaron, using both Jerome and Pseudo Dionysius in his Defensorum Ecclesiasticae Potestatis. And here I'm talking about the model that was really adopted by Begita and Alfonso Jaen of Jerome and the Hieronymites and so forth. And Begita's vision when she goes on pilgrimage to Bethlehem, she envisions the birth of the child being laid on the ground in humility. And you get these paintings with Begita present in the cave. And I did her pilgrimage. And here I am in the cave in Bethlehem with a Palestinian family with their new baby daughter brought to this cave. And this sort of ties in with some of our earlier academia, Bessarion talks on pilgrimage. Julian's life puzzles me. She quotes directly and repeatedly from Gregory's dialogues, giving the life of St. Benedict on scale and proportion in relation to the hazelnut image. How all that is made, all creation, seems full little in the presence of its maker, the creator, which indicates she probably was Benedictine. She is also deeply conversant in St. Benedict's rule. She could have been a schoolgirl or a lay sister or a nun at Benedictine Caro Priory. Clearly, she knows the monastic offices and the lessons from Holy Scripture with profound familiarity, these being further enhanced by her lifelong Benedictine Lectio Divina, her contemplation upon them. By 1396, we know Cardinal Adam Easton had returned to St. Cecilia in Rome, for we hear of Archbishop Arundel being touched by his kindness to him there. Adam Easton died in 1397. His tomb is not unlike that of the Black Prince. No, who I've seemed to have lost a slide. Okay, maybe it's here. There it is. Okay. At Canterbury, beside that of Thomas Becket, both with the Royal Arms of England. But it is in Rome, in his titular church as Cardinal of Cecilia and Trastevere. And it is even here near her tomb. Sorry, but Julian's amherst showing of love engrosses and underlines in red with great emphasis Cecilia's name, desiring to share that saint's 3 neck wounds, while the Norwich Castle manuscript likewise stresses St. Cecilia as model for writer and reader. When the bodies were later exhumed, both St. Cecilia's and Adam's were found incorrupt. The tomb shows the cardinal's hat with the tassels he was entitled to wear, and like that of the Black Prince, the royal arms of England, whose cardinal he was. But he is son of our Norwich just as much as Julian is daughter of this fair city. And here let me give the city of Norwich, as Julian and Easton both knew it from the lateral Psalter, where we see the cobblestone walls which still exist. The first extant bequest to Julian is late as 1394 of 2 shillings, left by the parish priest Roger Reed. Following that is one in 1404 by Thomas Edmund, chantry chaplain, of 12 pence, and for her maid Sarah 8 pence, while in 1815 the merchant John Plumpton left 40 pence for her, and 12 pence for her two maids, one named Alice. In 1416, the Countess of Suffolk, leaving her the famous 20 shillings. Julian, as an anchoress, would have received communion only 15 times a year, but daily could gaze upon the sacrament, upon the altar, through the window let into the church from the anchor hold. So had Brigitta in Rome had a hagioscope looking onto the altar at St. Damaso. Marjorie Kemp was to win from Archbishop Arundel, from talking with him under the stars in his garden at Lambeth Palace, the right to receive communion every Sunday, then a most rare privilege. But she was the Mayor of Lynn's daughter. A second window in Julian's anchor hold would have looked out onto the street, through which he could speak with others, including, memorably, our Julian of Norwich. And I think I need to end here and to note that this has tried to replicate the lecture I gave a long time ago. And it's now time for everyone to unmute and chime in with comments. And I hope it
Uh,
makes sense.
brava, brava.
It's a bit. I was trying to use historical research to give the context. And what I was finding is the texts that these people were writing all echo each other, uh, even when they disagree. I mean, the men are for hierarchies and the women are for equality, but they're using the same theology in so doing. And I would love that to have been understood a bit better by the Julian scholars who get very much sort of stuck on uh, seeing Amherst as a primitive early text rather than Westminster as the early text. And also they asked me, how could such a young person have written such excellent theology? Well, Catherine of Siena and Therese of Lisieux certainly were capable as very young people of writing magnificent theology. And when I found that young children have a depth that older people tend to lack. So I don't think it's necessary to say that there's progress. Um, so let's turn it over to your comments. And everyone has unmuted. And who would like to speak? And how can I do gallery? I can see faces and I I don't know if we've got a system for raising hands or
Yes, we do. Yes, ma'am.
okay. And so why don't you just voice your question and say your name?
Hola, hello, everyone. I'm Susan Carr, and I'm calling in from Houston, Texas. And
Yes.
Sister Senora, thank you very much. That was beautiful. This is my first time to join this session, and I'm so very grateful to you. That was lovely, and it was a blessing. So thank you very much.
Thank you and welcome to us. Right. Um, more comments, more questions, and unmute. Okay. I'm not seeing the. I think what I can do is interrupt the condivisione. Right now, I can see people, and um, and oh, it's lovely seeing people. Right, Ryan, what did you think of the parallels to Dante?
What you say about Dante not finishing or finishing, but only to begin a new text is absolutely fascinating. And I guess I was thinking about that and the versions that it goes through. If there's a decided sense when she, in the different versions that she's working through, that it's an unfinished work, or how she. I guess I wonder how she talks about the need for elaboration
Mhm.
of her own of these visions as she's working on them.
Yes. What I found fascinating is that Adam Easton read De Monarchia to counter it in
Wow.
defending the Pope, and so but it's fascinating that he and Chaucer both are in Chaucer's Second Nan's Tale of St Cecilia. Here you get to, and in the Second Nan's Tale, she's using Dante, Vergine Madre, Figlia del tuo figlio. So here you see a channel of Dante, knowledge of Dante coming into England through England's cardinal sense. And then you get that Trinity, which is on the Hell Gate, being a theme throughout Julian's showing. And we tend, as scholars, to limit ourselves to only being dealing with English literature or only dealing with Italian literature. And we don't make the leap between the two. But there was this kind of wonderful internet of the contemplatives all across Europe. And I loved coming across that. I came to Julian by the back door. I despised her. I despised women, and before I sort of turned into a scholar interested in women. And there I was in the Vatican Library reading about Begita and coming across Adam Easton of Norwich, and then starting to look at Julian's manuscripts and finding they all had Brigittine connections.
Mhm.
And so it did open up for me a whole new perspective. Um, Alex, you're unmuted. Can you say something?
No, I'm just so deeply immersed in what, this really magnificent talk you've given, Julia, and really thinking of this as an unfinished work, but that is continued, that's expanded over time and cross-referenced. And it's just incredibly moving to think that there was a manuscript that has survived,
Mhm.
but it survived in so many different contexts and that they echo each other. I'm still back in your talk, so,
Yes.
so I don't have a specific question right now, but I felt you gave us so much to think about.
Yes, I'm longing for someone to edit the Norwich Castle manuscript because it's a wonderful manuscript, and it just sort of has dropped out of. It's got mentioned in one bibliography of manuscripts I found at Oxford, but nobody else seems to have been very much interested in it. And yet it's pure Julian. It begins with well, supposedly it's an account to an anchoress and so on, and also the stories of the manuscripts, because they were it was under pain of death to be involved with that kind of theology. We don't realize how severely women were punished. Elizabeth Barton, as well as Marguerite Poretti and Joan of Arc, all ended up being executed in brutal ways because of their daring to enter into theological discourse. Julian Julian is protected by Adam Easton until he dies, and then you get the fear coming into the Amherst manuscript after Adam's death. And the Amherst manuscript was the only one that remained in England. All of the others were on the continent, and then finally all have come back now to England except one, which is in Paris. But the nuns, to preserve those manuscripts, went into exile, and at the end were even risking the guillotine, and were able to bring them back after the French Revolution. They were almost executed. They came back in the clothing of the dead, executed, guillotined Carmelite nuns to England. And those clothes are kept in the Benedictine Abbey that was in Stanhope and so forth. But to them, it meant so much using adios, Dr. Susan. It meant so much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. It meant so much that there was a form of feminist theology, that God became genderless, as I, it am. Jesus became mother. The stress, as in Dante, is the stress is on love, as the most important theological value we have, and also I sort of there's an index in one of the Adam Easton manuscripts where he's talking about a crippled woman whose gender is uncertain, and I suspect that that is Julian. She's the outsider. She wouldn't have been accepted at Carrow Abbey except as somebody who taught the girls. She's steeped in Benedictinism, but she is not under the roof any longer of Carrow Abbey. She's a hermit on her own. And so I see her as having access to all of that knowledge. She also knows Hebrew, and she's translating directly from Hebrew into Middle English 2 centuries before the King James Bible. But she's also the outsider, and which in a sense is a powerful position to be in. Women hermits especially were seen as prophets and could dialogue with kings and so on. But it was a knife edge between acceptance and destruction. But I want to hear your comments because this was a bit of a potpourri, and there was far too much material to put into. Yes, Yaroslav.
Thank you very much for this magnificent talk about Adam Easton and Julian Norwich. But I thought all this time about how complicated all these controversies in theology between Adam Easton and Wycliffe, maybe, because it also has had a dramatic consequences, very dramatic for many of different people, and even these who wasn't in England at this time, for example, for Birgitte of Sweden. I mean, when who would know what could happen to her if she was in other circumstances in this war. It was a 100-year war in this time, and some of these complicated moments is not very clear to me because you know, some of theologists wasn't very nice with the organization of Birgitte of Sweden, and we know that Adam Easton was defender of her, and some of his followers also was, for example, Thomas Netter, that also was a famous English theologist after after Adam Easton. He was his follower, and he defended Begita in the time of council in Constance. It was 1450 years, and what was complicated in the for me, because some of French theologies compared Begita, Wycliffe, which is other, and maybe he could compare with them also, and Julian Norwich. I talk about Jean Gerson, and why would all the what would he so cruel about them? Because in this time, meanwhile, he was also defender of Joan of Arc, and it's very hard to understand how it could be, because when you are sentenced against Birgitte of Sweden and Adam Easton, and also you can support Joan of Arc. And in this time, Thomas Netter was also against Joan of Arc in this judgment. You know,
Right.
and this, yes, it's hard to understand. Maybe it's very much politics in that, much of some different interests. It's very
Yes,
very complicated.
you're
Yes.
right that there was a great deal of resistance also to Birgitte, and particularly because she was a woman. And you'd already had that with the Perugian devil's advocate using Nicholas of Lyra's writings against Marguerite Porete. And then this blows up again at Basel and so forth at Constance. And it's sort of parts of the, but there always has been the the contemplative theology, which you got in the Friends of God, the Dominicans. They had to go underground with it because they were in difficulty with the Inquisition, Meister Eckhart and so on. But the contemplative theologians versus the career theologians, they tend to step outside of power, the contemplatives, whereas the career theologians are there in the theological faculties, like Jean Gerson, who is Chancellor of Paris, who is very suspicious of women, although he sides with Christine de Pizan, and but she's more secular than these other women. So it's stresses and strains. And what I had argued in our book, which is titled Equally in God's Image, Women in the Middle Ages, this was published years ago, and it was sort of the beginning of women's studies and so on. And what we were finding was in early Middle Ages, where women were learned in the convents and equally with men. And Christianity was the religion of women and slaves. And then at the time of the Crusades, Christianity adopts the Greco-Arabic form of the university, which is gender exclusive. Women are not allowed in the lecture halls after the scandal of Abelard and Eloise until we came back in. And Angela, you remember how difficult it was for us at Princeton, where we women were definitely non grata. And so we have to overcome centuries of resistance, but it's a resistance that's not Christian. The gospel is, in fact, I loved Adam Easton finally sort of realizing that he had to use the arguments from the gospel and the saints' lives to validate Begita. But at the beginning, when he was commissioned to do the canonization, he was very reluctant. It was only after he vowed in the dungeon under torture that if his life was spared, that he became enthusiastic for her. He went through a conversion himself on that. I don't know if I wasn't able to completely follow Yaroslav's argument. I'm sorry, my hearing impairment. Um, and
And
more
so my English is
comments.
not very good. So uh, I think not everyone understand fully me.
Mm. Um, I find it very interesting the parallels between San Sergio and Andrei Rublev and Julian's theology. That there is a kind of an affinity with the Russian contemplatives, monastics, and also what was happening. Because in a sense, mysticism, the contemplatives, regardless of which creed, faith they are, they all tend to come to similar understandings, uh, a oneing instead of hierarchies. And I love Julian for being against hierarchies. At the same time, she's seeped in everything that Adam Easton is doing. She clearly disagrees on that. And her very last words in the Amherst manuscript, which could have had her burned at the stake, is even Christian, you're equal Christian, uh, outside of hierarchies, which I see also as Dante doing in his image of God painted in our image. And that the when Beatrice smilingly coughs at Dante wanting to be noble, um, the the real argument in the Commedia is against nobility, against elitism, for gospel equality, for Franciscanism, and so forth. And Suzanne, could you unmute and say something?
Um, I'm in Colorado, and thank you for the talk. And I'm always interested in roles that women play in history, and when they're allowed to have power, when they take it, and when they're suppressed. So
Yes.
very interesting. I've written a couple of novels about women in history, one being about Vestal virgins,
Yes.
Rome. So it always fascinates me who got to have power, because really they were the freest women in Rome. And I also find it interesting. I wrote another story that took place in ancient Greece, and there the courtesans had the most power, really.
Right.
This is
Yes.
their, and they could converse with the men and everything. And women were so, I thought it was interesting when you said that she couldn't go out. She was cloistered. So it's always interesting that the women, sometimes the women, like the wealthy women, were much more cloistered than the poor
Right.
women.
Yes. Yes.
I found
Somehow,
that.
yes. Well, it's a paradox. If you give up power, you have it. But if you're in a situation of power, you've lost it. Which
Exactly.
that got said to me by a mayor of Boulder once. She was wonderful, and she was saying, "Use power and you lose it." But there was this sense the woman gained respect because she did make a sacrifice, like the Vestal virgins had to be virgin in order to have that power. The courtesans were not the respectable women. They'd given that up and so forth. So there seems to be a kind of sort of loss gain in acting out in
Mhm.
some paradoxical way. That's interesting, that. And Angela,
Thank you.
could you unmute?
It's just wonderful to hear you speak again, and it brings me right back to freshman year at Princeton. But I'm just so struck by the similarities of the times. How relevant all of this is to what we're experiencing now, with so many people asking for a voice, asking not to
Yes.
be invisible,
Mhm.
to be heard, to be seen. It's a fraught and difficult time, but a very exciting time.
Mhm.
But it's so clearly parallel to this period, because women, voices that are threatening, are the powerful always try to silence them and make them invisible, put them away. And it's a persistent issue. So it's just really fascinating to hear it but also to see someone like Adam Easton being, in a strange way, an ally. And we talk a lot about allies
Yes. Mhm.
and,
Mhm.
people helping. So it was just a wonderful, thank you so much for inviting me. It's
Oh,
just wonderful to hear you.
Angela and I were together at Princeton, and at a time when definitely women were not wanted. But there was this wonderful program too, where the non-likely person to go to Princeton got accepted. And Angela is the daughter of an Italian shoemaker in New York. And
In New
there she
Jersey.
was, and she
Mhm.
was the most wonderful student. And so we were both involved in going against the hierarchies, and we were the voices that normally would have been silenced. And there, we did get, I mean, I got silenced. You were going to go on and study international law. What did you do?
I did end up studying law, and I did a joint program in law school and divinity school. So I got a
Yes,
theology
yes,
degree, and I teach at Seton Hall Law School in Newark, New Jersey, which is only a little, maybe an hour or
yes,
so from Princeton.
yes.
And I teach the law and religion courses, First Amendment, those kinds of things. So
Fascinating, yes.
it really is. It's been a wonderful career path for me. But your advice and influence, my freshman year, just really set me on a path of knowing that faith and that it didn't need to be separate, that it had to be totally integrated. And it's
Right.
been,
Yes, this was a problem I found in American universities, especially state universities like Berkeley, is they're very Masonic, and religion is not to be a part of the scene. And the only way you get away with it is by being a medievalist. You cannot separate religion and medieval culture. It is medieval culture. And I was saying that the critical theory of the Middle Ages is theology. Wouldn't you think that, Ryan, in Dante, that yes, this is
Certainly,
structuring. Yes. Mhm.
certainly the kind of thinking that you have just shown over the last hour with, I mean, that Julian is doing, absolutely. It's amazingly thorough and inventive. Yeah.
Mhm. Right. Mhm. Yes. Anya, can you unmute?
I will,
Yes.
Julia. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I took so many notes, you wouldn't believe it. I'm a little distracted. I have a tree in the backyard that seems to be catching on fire on the power line. So I can smell it and there are little flames coming up. So I'll have to do something after this talk.
Right, sorry. Okay.
No, it's not your fault. I'm very new to the study. I do teach Boccaccio, and just as Angela was just mentioning, like, where do we see allies for women? I thought that was such a good observation, Angela, and because Adam Easton is an ally of Julian, and I often see Boccaccio that way. You read Boccaccio and the Seven Women and Santa Maria della Novella, waiting for their little rescuers to show up because they're just women, right? They're so weak. But you see throughout these stories, you see so many strong women, and even in the frame story. And I was thinking
Yes.
of that, Angela, when you were just mentioning the ally. And I always look for something like that when I teach right now, because I do teach freshmen. I introduce them to literature, and I often wonder, how do I pack traditional literature? How do we reread traditional literature from a new angle? Because I don't want to throw things out in this attempt to let's reinvent the canon, because I do teach engineering students. Keep that in mind.
Yes.
I'm not teaching,
Right.
right? So so what can we do with traditional literature? And I just love your approach, Julia, and seeing Adam Easton as this ally of these women who brings out these voices. And yeah, it was very inspiring. So there are a lot of thoughts. I also love this notion of you finish something to begin a new text. Because when I studied American literature as a very young student, T.S. Eliot came to my mind, right? The four quartets, in my end is my beginning. So there's the same kind of idea of the cyclical journey of, the spiritual journey that you end and yet begin. I thought that was really lovely. So, well, Julia, thank you so much. There was so much information, and I have to digest a lot of it.
Right. Well,
Really
I was
beautiful, and
having
I
to.
hope we can see. I hope we can hear what you left out, because
Right.
I'm
Well,
just
you'll
curious
find
now.
it in the written form. It's
Mhm.
just chock-a-block full of footnotes. Everything is documented from manuscripts. And this is why I think it didn't get accepted, because Adam Easton himself sort of got forgotten with the Reformation. And there he is, this absolutely brilliant person with flaws, but a fascinating story. And there was one person who wrote a doctoral thesis at the University of London, and I read that. And then I went and tracked down all of the manuscripts he was mentioning, and realizing how exciting these manuscripts are, and how they fitted in with Julian. But all of this work was so much primary research, and that's not what the academic world wants. It's what it should want, but it gets very nervous with it. They couldn't cope. I got absolutely sort of blackballed for this. I gave the lecture at Norwich Cathedral, and I immediately got told by Sister Rita Mary Bradley, and my edition of Julian actually got plagiarized. There was a sort of conspiracy against me, and it was very powerful, with a dreadful speculum review and so on and so forth. I got slaughtered, and I ended up being more like Elizabeth Barton and Margaret Pareto than Birgitta and Julian. But now there's a Cassandra. Could you unmute yourself and say something, or is it too difficult for you? We can't see you. We can only see that you've got a muted microphone. Okay, Lara, can you unmute? Yes. Now we can't hear you. Oh, no, we can't hear you. I don't know. think you haven't got your microphone on. Okay.
How about now?
Right. Yes. Mhm.
Okay, I have another microphone that was plugged in but not turned on. So I'm not a scholar, I'm just a fan of Julia's. And I just follow everything she has to say, so that I'm a musician and my degree is in early music. And all of my interest in history until I met Julia had to do with music history. And now I'm interested in more things than that, but probably coming at it over my head with these lectures and still loving it. So thank you, Julia. You give me
Thank
lots
you,
to
all of you. Right.
make me realize what I
Um,
have to learn. So thank you.
mhm. The written part of this is www.umilta.net/anchor ANCHOR.html. And there you will find all the references to the manuscripts and so forth. And I feel confident that this this argument, but at the same time, I know that but the Julian scholars will always say in their published work, do not trust. So forth. Partly because as a paleographer, I actually worked with the manuscripts and could see, and I worked with major paleographers like Ian Doyle, and we were seeing the dating of the manuscripts, which the Julian scholars have got all wrong because they're not trained in that field. But in the academic world, it's who gets parroted most, who wins, not the one who is a solitary voice in the wilderness saying, and so this is awkward. So don't get yourselves into trouble by citing me and so forth, and because somebody once told me that the Dante scholars out there are out there with knives. I haven't found that. I found the Dante scholars are wonderfully kind and encouraging. But amongst the Julian scholars, I will say they are out there with knives. And I would like to, before we end, my edition of the Tesoro of Brunetto Latino is printed, and I will have it tomorrow from the Regione Toscana. And it's Dante's Education. And Ryan, did I send you the? Yes, I sent you the DVD, so you've got it. Yes,
I do. I certainly do. Yes, but I'm looking forward to seeing the printed version. That sounds very
right.
exciting.
The printed version is much briefer. I was able to put everything into the. Even this talk tonight was much a briefer version of what I got written with all of the footnotes. But we've gone over our time. We've spent actually 2 hours. And I'm sorry it was too long, and I'm so grateful for this audience.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Julia.
Thank
Thank
very much.
you.
So,
And next
Great to
time
meet everyone.
it's Cardinal Bessarion. No, it's Cardinal. I forget which one. Okay, but we're doing a row of 3 cardinals, just the scholarly ones, not the ones like Bishop de Pense, but the decent ones who were on the side contemplatives. Right.
Good.
Good night, everyone, and thank you.
Thank you so
Good night,
much.
Julia. Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Na noche.
Right.